And then we have also run things like the Development Research Week and other educational events. And the events I think that we're most proud of instigating across the college are events with groups like yourselves from outside, groups like Social Justice Ireland, Trócaire, Concern and so on, because they really have informed the way we view the kind of work that we might do in the future. We very much recognise that the most relevant questions can only really be asked by practitioners, and we would like you to understand that we are here to help in whatever way we can to formulate the mechanisms to address some of the challenges that you face in your work. So it was with great pleasure then that when Sean approached us last year and suggested that we might host something together, it was with great pleasure that we decided to do so. And I must admit, having read a bit about him, I felt a little bit of intrepidation about coming to meet him, because it was so clear from his work as a socio-economic commentator in Ireland and as a social advocate that he would be quite a formidable person. But and when I met him, I found indeed he was very active, very action-orientated man, but also a very reflective man. So Sean, as you know, has been the director of Social Justice Ireland for some 20 years, but what people tend to forget is that he's of course also a long history of working in Africa for over 10 years and has served for more than a decade on the National Economic and Social Council. He has obviously been an extraordinary, compassionate advocate and a committed advocate for social justice in Ireland and for changes in equity and sustainability in the way that we manage our affairs. But what people tend to forget is that he is also, of course, a sociologist and a widely published author, and has either written or edited some 27 books, along with his, a co-author, Bridget Reynolds, also involved with Social Justice Ireland. Some of these would include titles such as Basic Incomes Worldwide, Development, Social Equity and Sustainability. And one that I think the title I love particularly is Sharing Responsibility and Shaping the Future. And so he has reflected, I think, more than many of us on what inequity means and what the long-term effects of lack of equity and lack of advocacy within our communities can do, and how that shapes us. And I would like very much to take this opportunity for Trinity to stand up and be counted, along with Social Justice Ireland and also with the Society of African Missions, and in sharing responsibility and helping to shape the future by bringing you in, by hearing your voice and by being with you to try and address the challenges as you go forward. So with that, I'm going to leave it at that and simply introduce our main speaker this morning, our main co-chair for the morning, Sean Healy. Thank you.
I think that's an exaggerated position both on myself but also on my role this morning. I'm simply meant to introduce you to there are many people here that are members of, or their organisations are members of Social Justice Ireland. There are others who may not have heard of us before. We're an organisation or a think tank made up of individuals and groups. There are over 80 organisations who are members, and any individual can join as well. We have several hundred individuals who have joined us. We are basically we call ourselves Social Justice Ireland because we're interested in building a just society, which we define as a society where human rights are respected, human dignity protected, human development facilitated, and the environment respected and protected. And we work on that in a variety of different ways. And this particular area of the sort of Ireland's relationship with the global south is one of those issues that has been at the core of what we do right throughout our period in existence, and the work that we've done, and a lot of publications and so on. I'm not going to delay you on this. There's more. There'll be this flyer. If you want more information on Social Justice Ireland, will be outside. You can pick it up at the break or after the event itself. Just to let you know, you will have received a copy of a policy briefing, which is one of the publications that we publish. We bring out a number of these every year. The one for the most recent one published today is on Ireland and the Global South. and it looks at issues around Ireland's relationship with the Global South. It looks at the ODA budget, it looks at the MDGs, and beyond the MDGs, beyond 2015, some of the issues that will be talked about here today. We have suggestions about the role that Ireland could play in terms of contributing to that development and opening up that world that needs to be addressed maybe more radically than it was the last time around. I'm not going to delay you on that. I simply have to introduce the real chair for the morning, who's Professor Carol Newman. Carol she's the assistant professor. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics here in Trinity. Very notably, she's an international development research team champion, and she's a research associate also with the Institute for International Integration Studies in Trinity, and she has the most unenviable task of holding all of these speakers in both panels to 15 minutes each or whatever it is. So we wish her luck and hand over to Carol. Thank you.
Good morning, Minister Costello, distinguished speakers and guests. It's my pleasure, as champion of the International Development Research Team here in Trinity, to welcome you to Dublin and to Trinity for this conference, Beyond the Millennium Development Goals, the Future of Africa and Ireland's Role, organised, as you know, by Tidy Social Justice, and as part of this Development Research Week here in Trinity. So as chair, one of my main role is to kind of keep the speakers in line, but I also want to use this opportunity just to kind of set some context for what we're going to discuss this morning, which I think will be a very illuminating discussion and a very interesting debate. So there's no doubt, as we all know here, that Ireland has a long history of successful development cooperation in Africa. Irish missionaries, NGOs were world renowned for the work in Africa, and Irish aid has had a very significant presence in addressing poverty through its work on tackling hunger and undernutrition, health and gender issues, climate change and governance. Overseas development aid to Africa from Ireland over the last decade has amounted to over €6 billion and has always had a very strong poverty focus. And as the deadline for achieving the Millennium Development Goals draws nearer, it is now time to really reflect on the nature of our development cooperation with Africa and look to the future. And as outlined by the Department of Foreign Affairs Africa strategy, there are significant opportunities for Ireland for increased international integration between Ireland and other African nations, particularly in trade, investment and also in technology. And this will be to the mutual benefit of all partners concerned. And this strategy is welcome and very much in line with UNDP recommendations for the future of Africa beyond the Millennium Development Goals. But of course, shifting focus towards more market-based initiatives introduces a new set of challenges and raises a new set of considerations that do need careful consideration. So what I would like to do, just to kind of open the conference, if you like, is to pose some of these questions and to just to kind of attempt to provide some context for the conference and the discussions we will have, no doubt, throughout this morning. So first of all, an important question in this debate is to what extent market-based initiatives should replace traditional overseas development aid. In a world of ever-tightening resources, which is something we're very conscious of in Ireland, of course, in making this move, do we run the risk of needing to justify aid by outlining how it will benefit the donor countries economically? And I think this is an important consideration. And of course, the extent to which this type of cooperation can squeeze out ODA for more basic needs such as hunger, nutrition and health, where Ireland has made major contributions in the past, is also something that needs to be given careful thought. Of course, questions still remain over the quality of service delivery in many African countries, and inequalities continue to persist and in many cases are widening as the pace of growth quickens in Africa. People remain vulnerable to shocks such as unemployment, weather-related events, and we need to think about the role of overseas development aid in addressing these issues post-2015. And second, in moving to a new model of development cooperation which focuses on private sector development, this also requires careful consideration because there are many constraints to private sector development in Africa. And these include, amongst many others, skills shortages, poorly defined property rights, corruption, health, safety and quality standards, a functioning tax system that can help redistribute wealth and that can help this private sector development have an impact on the economy long term. Foreign direct investment into Africa and increased trade with our African partners will no doubt create jobs in African countries, will generate economic activity, will lead to increased exports, which will all be to the benefit of economic development. But of course, from an economic point of view and from a theoretical point of view, and as Ireland's economic history has taught us, this will have a much more significant and long-lasting effect if these initiatives, if foreign investors into Africa are linked in with the local economy and the local private sector. So in other words, if the domestic private sector is integrated into the supply chain in this way, it can really have a significant effect on development. So these constraints are something that certainly do need to be given careful thought. A third point I would like to make is in relation to the role of technology. And there is no doubt that new and innovative technologies have the potential to radically change the nature and pace of development in Africa. But of course, attention should be paid to the capacity locally to absorb such technologies and also their sustainability and their relevance within these contexts. Fourth and finally, this shift in focus will also require greater policy coherence and efforts in ensuring that Irish and European trade and investment related policies don't conflict with this new development agenda. And this goes both ways. New measures should be considered in the context of the local policies and strategies for development already in place in our African partner countries. So my aim in raising these issues really is to set some context for our discussion this morning on the future of aid to Africa and the constraints to development that continue to persist and require due consideration in taking a new approach to aid that relies more on trade and investment. So I look forward to our discussions this morning on what Ireland's role might be in addressing the development challenge beyond 2015. But to begin today's conference, it's my pleasure to introduce Minister of State at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with responsibility specifically for trade and development, Minister Joe Costello. Minister Costello served in the Seanad from 1989 to 1992. In 1992 he was elected to Dáil Éireann, where he served until 1997, and following this he was re-elected to Seanad Éireann and served as leader of the Labour Seanad group from 1997 to 2002. In 2002 he was re-elected to the Dáil and has been in every subsequent election since. He's been Labour Party spokesperson on education, justice, defence, European affairs, human rights and transport, and he has served as the Labour Party representative on the British-Irish parliamentary body from 1997 to 2007. He was also chairperson of Labour's Policy Development Commission from 1995 to 2002. So with this background and with this introduction, I welcome you, Minister, and I'd like to hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karen Newman, and good morning to everybody. And I'm delighted to be invited here by Trinity International Development Initiative and by Social Justice Ireland. We're organising this event to speak here today, and I want to pay tribute to Martina Hennessy from Tidy, as I call it, for the great work that has been done over the last short number of years. I've had the opportunity of speaking at a number of the fora before, but it's a fantastic idea, and it has been very effective, very efficient, and it's filled a very good niche in relation to the issues that I'm dealing with. And secondly, Sean Healy, and of course Sean and Bridget are well known to most of you here, Bridget Reynolds, for the work they have done on social justice over the years. Sean was telling me that he was in the Dáil yesterday before a committee, and that he's going to be back in the Dáil again today before another committee. Now, it's not so much Sean coming before a committee, it's Sean coming in and scaring a committee. And he does that regularly. But I hadn't thought that he was going to be involved in trying to scare me as well. I thought that his influence only extended to domestic politics, and that he wasn't going to get involved in, shall we say, global development issues. And it almost makes me, it reminds me of this, and some of you may have heard this story about our present president, Michael D. Higgins. At one time when Frank Kluski was the leader of the party, and we had reached, the Labour Party had reached what we call a margin of error. We were down to 3% in the polls, so the future was very much in doubt. and Frank convened a meeting so that we would see how we would plot a way forward, if there was a way forward. So looking around the room, there was one eminent person missing, and that was Micheal D. Higgins. So to put on the monitors anyway, and eventually discover that there was Micheal D. in the Dáil chamber, speaking passionately and eloquently on global issues and global justice and so on. So Frank says, there's Micheal D. The Labour Party is about to disappear, and Micheal D. is out there taking the easy option. He's saving the world. So anyway, I won't say Father Sean Healy is doing quite that, taking the easy option, but he's doing a lot of both. So I'm delighted to be here today to speak on this issue, and it is of course an issue that's very much concerns us in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and particularly in my area in relation to development, because we are entering the presidency, and there are a lot of issues in relation to this that we have to deal with. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals review is coming up as well. So quite clearly, it's one of the burning issues of the day as to how we deal with development moving forward from where we are at the present time. So the event underlines the continuing strong Irish commitment to international development and the fight to end poverty and hunger. It also helps us to focus on the major international challenges in a difficult global environment of working towards a new framework for global development. Since my appointment as Minister of State for Trade and Development nearly 1 year ago, I have been impressed by the enthusiasm, by the commitment and professionalism within the development community here in Ireland. It is clear to me that by working closely together, at home and abroad, we can make a lasting positive impact on the lives of women, men and children living in poverty. The government recognises this, and we have explicitly reaffirmed our strong commitment to international development as a central element in Ireland's foreign policy. And that's part of the reason that Irish Aid is not an agency. It is an integral part of the foreign policy of the Department of Foreign Affairs, which I think is very important, and it gives it a greater clout than in a lot of other countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, the title of today's conference challenges us to consider how Africa has changed since the Millennium Development Goals were first agreed at the turn of this century, and the role for Ireland's relationship with the countries of Africa in the new global context. And Carl spoke about the Africa strategy, so we will address that too. The MDGs set out specific targets for reducing poverty, hunger, disease and inequality across the globe by 2015. They commit the world community to eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, to achieving universal primary education, to empowering women and promoting gender equality, to reducing child and maternal mortality, to combating HIV/AIDS and malaria, and to ensuring environmental sustainability. And significant progress has been made towards achieving many of these targets and reducing poverty. The MDGs have provided the international community with a clear set of targets and goals. They have given focus to what aid should be used for, and part of the great attraction of those targets was that they were straightforward, they were clear, they were simple, they were visual. Because they are easy to communicate to the public, they have galvanised political support for results in areas where progress must be made. Development results in the last 10 years have been the best ever recorded. Between 2005 and 2010, the total number of poor people around the world fell by nearly 500 million. Millions of child deaths have been avoided thanks to greater access to vaccines. 40 million more children are going to school today than at the turn of the millennium. In Irish Aid's programme countries in Africa, we have 7, we have contributed to this progress and can see the results for ourselves. Over the last 10 years, for example, income per person has doubled in Mozambique. In Tanzania, mortality rates in children under 5 have fallen by about 40%. In Tigray, in northern Ethiopia, I saw for myself the impact of our programme there, our safety net programme. Agricultural production of grain more than doubled between 2004 and 2009. The number of primary schools has increased, thus helping to reduce class sizes and improve the quality of education. And the public service is now better trained, providing more efficient services to the community. But while there have been many positives, the MDG approach has also revealed quite a number of flaws. Global targets and results have hidden inequalities across regions and countries. Vital issues such as sustainable growth, job creation, trade and protecting the environment were not adequately addressed in the MDGs. A one-size-fits-all approach gave the impression that problems and solutions are the same everywhere, and of course clearly they are not. In 2012, almost 1 billion women, men and children continue to be hungry and live in extreme poverty. Maternal mortality levels remain shockingly high, and while there are more children in school, the quality of education is still a major concern. Climate change is contributing to an increased frequency of disasters in affected countries. While early and comprehensive planning for the post-2015 agenda is vital, we cannot let this distract us from the very real challenges over the next 3 years of meeting the commitments we signed up to 12 years ago. 3 high-level events have been held since 2000 to monitor progress on the MDGs. The 2005 World Summit, the 2008 high-level event on the MDGs, and the 2010 Summit on the MDGs. The 4th and final high-level event prior to 2015 is the MDG Special Event, and this will be held during the 68th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2013. This will be the last opportunity to review progress in achieving the MDGs at head of state and government level in advance of the 2015 target date. The special event is also likely to consider how key development issues should be taken forward post-2015. So it has 2 major functions: to determine what happens up to 2015, but again it's the first serious look at what's going to happen after 2015. So the Irish presidency comes at a crucial period for shaping the post-2015 global development framework. A key priority for Ireland's presidency will be ensuring that the European Union adopts a strong, coherent and above all credible position for the MDG special event. So that is the challenge that we will have in the Irish presidency, is to seek to establish a framework moving forward in relation to the post-MDG period. So in discussions on the post-2015 development framework, we will build on our commitment to eradicate hunger and seek to highlight the important linkages between hunger, nutrition and climate change, and to have these linkages adequately reflected in the international discussions, both between the 27 member countries, but also to engage the United Nations as well, and the World Bank and other bodies. We also need to critically look at the role of aid post-2015 and indeed to look beyond aid. At last year's international meeting on effective aid in Busan, where Ireland's government and civil society delegations worked together very closely, it was recognised that aid, no matter how effective, is only one part of the solution to underdevelopment and to poverty. At that meeting, international agreement was reached to move beyond the mechanics of aid delivery towards a broader focus on the drivers of effective development. Resources from increased trade, private sector investment, remittances and investments from emerging economies can all have a significant impact on driving sustainable, inclusive growth and reducing dependency on aid. And if growth is to reduce poverty, it needs to address inequality. Progressive taxation and spending in the national budget, targeted to poorest regions, cash transfers to vulnerable groups and redistributing assets, for example through land reform, can play an important part in addressing unequal access by women and men to opportunities and services. Tackling gender inequality is a key dimension of equitable and fair growth, and we can see this particularly in Africa, which has experienced nearly 10 years now of quite substantial economic growth. So things are changing in that respect, and we have to take all of that into consideration. The discussion to agree a new international framework beyond the MDGs need to reflect these changes together with the evidence we have accumulated and the lessons we have learned about contributing more effectively to a reduction of poverty and to disadvantage. So a word on the Africa strategy that Carla referred to. The profound changes we have seen across Africa since the MDGs were first agreed at the turn of the century have prompted an evolution in Ireland's relationship with the countries in Africa. The Africa strategy of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, launched at the First Africa Economic Forum in September 2011, recognises the changing relationship with Africa and provides the framework to deepen our engagement with the continent. The Africa strategy brings together all aspects of Ireland's relations with Africa in a coherent and integrated way. And these are political relations, development cooperation, and the building of opportunities for closer economic and trade relations. It builds on our contribution to economic and social development and recognises the truly enormous potential for economic and trade links over the coming years. Over the past year, we have stepped up our engagement with countries in Africa through a series of high-level bilateral visits and also through a range of seminars and events to support greater bilateral trade between Ireland and Africa. Some of these events have been country-specific, for example, the Ghana-Ireland Economic Forum, while others focused on general funding opportunities, such as meetings arranged by Enterprise Ireland with the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank and with Consulting Ireland. Others were sector-specific, such as the research report entitled Winning Business in Africa, which we co-funded with IBEC and which identified a pipeline of €12 billion in engineering and infrastructure contracts in Africa that Irish business can bid for over the next couple of years. This is in the context of the World Bank and the context of the European Union. 2 weeks ago, I presented a progress report on the Africa strategy at the second Africa-Ireland Economic Forum, which took place here in Dublin. Representatives of over 140 Irish companies and 25 African embassies attended the event to discuss how Irish business could trade and invest with Africa and could contribute to the economic development of the continent. Next week, I will lead a trade mission with Enterprise Ireland to South Africa and will then make a trade-focused visit to Ghana and Nigeria. And these will be pretty much the first that is taking place in the continent of Africa in that respect. Developing stronger links in West Africa was a particular objective this year under the Africa strategy, and I feel that there is a great opportunity for the private sector to play a more important role in developing sustainable economic growth in that region. For example, I will visit Tema Port in Ghana, which is benefiting from the advice and experience of Dublin Port Company here. And that's been going on for the last couple of years, where people are coming over and the skills of management and so on are being transferred. While the Africa strategy gives a stronger emphasis to building trade, we know that economic growth alone will not solve ingrained problems of poverty and hunger. Serious inequalities persist in many regions, and we must continue to prioritise the right to eradicate poverty and hunger in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where we concentrate, through our own Irish Aid programme and through our engagement in the European Union and the United Nations and indeed elsewhere. Our continuing commitment to these objectives is clear, not just from the Africa strategy and from our continuing commitment to Irish Aid, but also from our current role as chair of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and next year's role as EU presidency, as well as our campaign for election to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that's one that's very hotly contested at the present time, but the vote will take place in the United Nations in New York next Monday, the 12th of November, so we'll see whether or not we are successful there. It's a very important issue for us to that particular committee. We are showing in very practical ways that the priorities of peace, human rights and development remain at the heart of our foreign policy. Importantly, we are demonstrating that the pursuit of these goals is compatible, coherent and indeed interdependent with the priorities of global economic stability, growing international trade and investment flows and improving Ireland's own trade and investment relationships worldwide. Just a word on the White Paper review before I finish. Finally, I would like to mention the important work we have undertaken over the past year in reviewing the 2006 White Paper on Irish Aid. The review has been very extensive and worthwhile. It has involved vibrant consultations in Ireland with public consultation meetings across the country and focus group meetings with a variety of stakeholders, including NGOs, the private sector and migrant communities living in Ireland. In total, over 1,000 people participated in these meetings. 165 written submissions were received, and a strong social media presence allowed us to reach beyond the typical development audience, if I might describe it as that. A variety of themes emerged from those discussions, including the role of the European Union in global development and how Ireland engages with it. We have now decided to publish a fresh new policy to guide Ireland's contribution to international development, which builds on our strong track record and ensures that Ireland remains at the forefront of global development for the coming years. And that will be shortly published. This will build on pre-existing strengths of the programme and will outline other important priorities such as deepening an engagement with Irish people and institutions, responding to climate change, and at a time of budgetary constraint, bringing a greater degree of focus to our work. So I am confident that the review will result in a strengthening aid programme which will remain strongly focused on the poorest countries in Africa and the fight to end global hunger. So could I say in conclusion that that is the manner in which we envisage moving forward in the future. Irish Aid remains an integral part of our approach to foreign policy and how we deal with what we would regard as the poorest areas in the world. It will remain, as it has been to date, untied aid. It will not be conditional in relation to the way we move forward. And that is particularly important when we consider that we will be looking at, through the Africa strategy, we will be looking at trade and investment and business. So one will not be linked directly to the other, but there will be complementary in terms of what is needed in a changing world. And what the way we will look forward will be engaging the private sector as we're doing at the present time. We want Irish companies to engage in Africa, to go out there, to meet, get partners out there, to engage in the development of Africa. It's good for them, but it's certainly good for Africa as well, and every single African country is enthusiastic about that particular engagement. But what we will always be saying to those private companies is that we expect ethical engagement. We wanted to build on what the missionaries have done in the past. We want to build on what Irish Aid has done, the good reputation that has been built up over the years, and that we would see the new level of engagement in terms of the Africa strategy being based on the same principles. So that is the manner in which we see ourselves moving forward in terms of Irish Aid, in terms of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and that is what we hope to bring to the table in the discussions of the MDG goals moving forward. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Minister, and I believe the Minister has to leave shortly, and he sends his apologies for that. Yeah, indeed. So thank you very much. We now move on to our first panel discussion, and we have three speakers that will discuss the issue of the MDGs, the future of Africa and Ireland's role. We'll begin with Dr. Micheal Collins of the Nevin Economic Research Institute, who I believe will provide us with an overview of how funding has changed for the development sector in Ireland over time and how this compares to the various commitments that we have made. Dr. Collins is a Senior Research Officer at NARI with research interests in the area of income distribution, taxation, economic evaluation and public policy. He's a graduate of NUI Galway and UCC, and he received his PhD from Trinity College here. And he's also a Fellow of the Regional Studies Association. So he will begin our panel discussion. Following this, we will have Mr. Charles Akelyira, who is Deputy Director of the UN Millennium Campaign in Africa. He's a Ghanaian national, and he has over 20 years of experience in anti-poverty campaigning and is a leading intellectual from the African continent. And we're delighted that he could join us here and make the trip from Nairobi yesterday evening. Charles holds a master's degree in development economics from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, the Netherlands, and a bachelor's degree in economics and geography from the University of Ghana. Our final speaker this morning will be Professor Paul Walsh from University College Dublin, who will provide us with an overview of the current status of African development and will comment on the MDGs and their influence to date. Professor Walsh took up a chair in international development studies in the School of Politics and International Relations in UCD in 2007. He received his PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1994, and between 1992 and 2007 he was a professor here at the Department of Economics in Trinity College. He coordinates the UCD PhD in Global Human Development, and he chairs the first ever joint degree between UCD and Trinity College, the TCD UCD Masters in Development Practice. So I'd like to welcome all three speakers and thank them for participating this morning. Each will have 15 minutes. I will let them know when 2 minutes are left by holding up a sign, and Sarah will also be letting them know from the back in case they don't see me. So we're in a tight time constraint. We want to have as much time for questions as possible, so I would ask them to keep it. So we'll start out with Dr. Collins.
Thank you to Carl and to the Minister for his earlier remarks as well. Firstly, can I say it's a pleasure to have been invited to input into this. I think I was thinking back, I think the first chat I had about this with Sean and Bridget was about 24 months ago or something like that, and then with Sarah Lavie here in terms of its evolution. It's nice to see this come to fruition. Indeed, there's some very, as I think was reflecting some of the earlier comments this morning, some very interesting inputs from various NGOs into the whole set of issues around development and development choices, and it's important, I think, that events like this reflect that, and to Social Justice Ireland as well, who over the years have been really very good at highlighting in particular Ireland's ODA commitments and pointing at times towards one or two issues I might come back to at the end here about us needing to strategically think about where we're going with our overseas aid over time. Reflecting what Carl said, I was asked to, or I forgot whether I was asked or I offered or both, but anyway, to look at this initially from a slightly more Irish perspective, and then the other speakers can follow with the different angles that were mentioned, and therefore in the short space of time to cover the ground with some perspectives on progress, on funding, on targets, and then on the future in terms of overseas aid. I thought I'd just quickly start with something on progress. If we, without any doubt, there's been significant progress in terms of development and various development targets over time. I suppose, at glance at the United Nations Human Development Report or the reports over the years reveal that very notable moves forward over time. But I suppose that's also been quite uneven as well. I'll show you that in just 1 second. But uneven in terms of, particularly for our focus here this morning is on Africa. It's noticeable the slow progress relative to other regions that Africa has been making. It has been making significant progress nonetheless, but slow relative to others. I noted the most recent United Nations Development Programme Africa Human Development Report pointed towards what they described as a series of lost years for Africa. The existence of those, or the fear that they may ever reappear again, I suppose, has to be something we need to bear in mind in terms of thinking about where we're going with development over time. Of course, those lost years occurred for various reasons. Most noticeably, I suppose, around HIV, or the issues around HIV and AIDS, which in many degrees put much of development in Africa into a reverse gear, and it's both interesting and worrying as to where that's got to now. You'd almost describe it as a sort of sticking plaster solution that's been found for some of those HIV/AIDS issues, rather, with the sort of rollout of antiretroviral programs, which are in many ways dampening down the impact of that disease, but not actually removing it. And of course, the long-term sustainability of funding those programs as the prevalence of that disease increases doesn't add up actually when you think about it in the longer terms. And so there's dangers in terms of those lost years. When you're first speaker, you can put in a line like more from other speakers on that and move on, which is a very, very safe thing to do. Frightening when you're further down the line of speakers, I accept. This is the graph from that United Nations report on Africa. Hard to see, I'm sure, but comparing sub-Saharan Africa in particular with the progress of South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. And it's a graph representing the score of those regions on the Human Development Index. That's the index that runs from 0, which is in effect no development, to 1, which is maximum development, and is comprised of indicators capturing countries and regions' performance across income levels, across life expectancy figures, and across education. Pretty good sort of feel for how things are going. The green line on the bottom being sub-Saharan Africa, and really since the 80s across the decades to 2000, not a whole lot, and then some progress, but slow relative to other parts of the world since, which in a sense highlights some of the issues that I know we'll be coming back to talk about. So progress, but challenges remain. In terms of Ireland and Ireland's role around overseas aid and our commitment overall to development, I suppose we sometimes forget, and that's why I thought I might almost state the obvious here, that that commitment has been remarkably strong over time. I suppose reflecting somewhat a tradition of realizing and appreciating that we as a nation have a role in terms of overseas aid, and also I suppose somewhat reflecting our own history, which coming back to the focus that the Minister mentioned in terms of our own ODA programme on hunger in particular, reflects in effect in global terms our own experience of hunger here in the 1800s. I suppose over time we've moved interestingly, or we're moving in a transition from what in effect was church and NGO-led to government-led overseas aid input. And I thought I'd just pull out the figures briefly because, again, I think we look at, maybe we don't look at them, which is a problem. We forget sometimes the sheer way in which our overseas aid program has changed over time, and it does reflect notably the commitment that we've made when at least the formal government program rolled off in 1974. It was a typo here. It was €1.5 million that funding was provided. And if you look at when we passed key benchmarks along the way since then, it's really quite remarkable. Ireland's overseas aid budget exceeded €100 million for the first time in 1995. €200 million for the first time in 1999, €300 million for the first time in 2001, €400 million for the first time in 2002, and €500 million for the first time in 2005. We're now at about just over €635 million. I think 639 actually is the planned figure for this year. Quite remarkable growth in that, reflecting fairly serious societal commitment to it, and we shouldn't, in a sense, forget that. If you look at it over the last 15 years, overall, it's been growing with a bump, reflecting the bump that Ireland's experienced from 2007-2008 onwards in terms of reductions to our ODA programme. I see something that's mentioned on the front of the Social Justice Ireland document this morning. But over that 15-year period, 8.2 billion euro is what we've allocated in ODA, and that's dramatic and it's significant, and we shouldn't, in a sense, forget that big commitment that we have been making. On targets, I thought I'd maybe mention briefly the elusive United Nations overseas development aid target. The history of the target itself is intriguing. The World Bank in 1969 established a Commission on International Development to go away and think about what countries should be doing in terms of making commitments to ODA. It was led by Lester Pearson, the former Canadian Prime Minister. And I think, as I understand it, at least behind the scenes, the discussion went that it should be 1% of that countries should give about 1% of their annual income to support developed countries. Many countries were frightened by the prospect that it would be so high. And so they suggested 0.5%, and that ultimately led to a compromise of 0.7% of GNP, which is what the United Nations adopted at the 1970 UN General Assembly in Resolution 2626. So it's a target, somewhat compromised target perhaps, but a target that's been around for a very long time. And of course, over that period, very few countries have got there. I think that the latest figures for Europe, at least, are that 4 European countries are reaching that ODA target. And for Ireland, despite our very significant growth in ODA over time, and indeed our signing up to that target, I suppose the Irish story is one of regular commitments to that target, in a sense revisions in terms of we're not going to get there or we'll get there over a longer period, the creation of various interim targets and revisions to those interim targets, or returning to older interim targets over time as well. I thought it was interesting a few years ago, prior to the economic recession, that the OECD, in looking at Ireland's aid budget, noted that while we had made commitments, what was lacking was a plan to achieve those commitments, or a pathway through which we might get there, and the pace at which we did, or which we should rather. And that's actually very important. Again, something I'll come back to in just a second. Because if we are to continue to grow our aid programme, and it is a cash budget in effect that goes to Irish aid to allocate to these targets, goals and policies that we I think strongly believe in as a society, we do need to think strategically about how that's going to change over time and what sort of pace it's going to move at, so that planning can happen both nationally and in our partner countries to be able to usefully use those funds. I note for Ireland the 2015 target really across a European level remains, that is to reach the United Nations 0.7% goal. I put a question mark in after that because I do really wonder if that's feasible or realistic given where we are. It probably isn't. I think that's to be sensible about it, and maybe we need to think about that too. I took this graph from the CSO, and somebody needs to put the CSO on a course to draw nicer graphs, I think. But so I won't stop here long. The other line is just showing we haven't got to that red line higher up in terms of what the United Nations target is. And I suppose then to finish on this in terms of looking to the future, a couple of points that I thought were worth making. Firstly, it strikes me that to a certain degree we treat our overseas aid budget as a bit somewhat being below the radar, and I wonder why that is the case. We I think should be very proud of the scale of that budget and the impact that it has. It perhaps isn't the main plank, but it is one of the main planks of Irish foreign policy at this stage. we very much play, a big part in the world stage, I would have thought, in development terms. I think Ireland's ODA programme has got an excellent focus, and that's all the more reason why it shouldn't be below the radar and why we should be triumphing it. I wonder if, to a certain degree, we don't want to highlight it too much because it might highlight an area that could potentially be cut, and that may explain some of it. But we should be proud of it, and we should be proud of both our long history there, our focus on a number of the world's poorest countries from our development programme, our focus on hunger, and if we are to move towards where the discussion is going later perhaps in terms of what the post-MDG international commitment mechanisms might look like, we have to be very careful not to take our eye off some of the basic stuff around poverty and hunger, which is really at the core and perhaps essential before we begin to pursue any other targets. So it's an excellent focus, and we should remember that interesting moves into Asia as well in that program, which and potential for expansion there, which we should watch. It strikes me that there are some misrepresentations about our aid program as well. I noted at one stage the minister said a few months ago that we're borrowing all of the money that we use for overseas aid. Of course, we're not, as we are for the funds we put into education or health or whatever. It's a proportion of it that we're borrowing, given where we are at the moment. It is nonetheless scarce resources, and we do need to use it properly. And then finally, if we're thinking about the large and ongoing commitments in terms of ODA in the years to come, we clearly need to plan to reach any target, whether it's the UN target or an interim target, and we need to be a bit more proactive in doing that. And then finally, and this is where I'll bring in my hobby horse and then gallop off on it, I'll say that clearly we need to find some revenue sources for that as well. It would seem to me that the time for a Tobin tax or a financial transaction tax has finally come. It's certainly happening at a European level. We're a bit uncomfortable with it in an Irish sense. But it's an obvious source for development and for funding all the major development commitments in the years to come. I wanted to highlight on a forum like this a concern about the fact that those funds, as they finally come on stream, have to a certain degree been captured by issues around recession and national deficits and abridging those. Yet they provide potentially to provide around 300 to 600 million euro per annum just from Ireland, if you look at the research in that area. And it would strike me that that's an obvious source for future development funds and for future development commitments and for future attempts to reach the MDGs and whatever might follow. And the development community really needs to reassert itself in terms of those funds and in terms of securing those funds to fund future development. Thank you.
Good morning. Sometimes I don't recognize my own surname, Akelyira. It is a very quiet surname that I use only when I need to use my passport or attend an interview. Otherwise, I get known as Charles Abugri, and I like the Charles Abugri sound of it. I work for a little entity called the UN Millennium Campaign, which is located inside UNDP. And this was set up in 2002 by Kofi Annan. And the purpose was to try and work especially with civil society and social movements to campaign for the MDGs. So that's, in that sense, it's an entity with a very defined timeline. It ought to die in 2015. But I'm sure that as UN entities go, it might be reborn in another name, post-2015 something. So we're busy with post-2015. So I manage the Africa regional work out of Nairobi. When the Millennium development goals were formulated, they were practically implemented only in 2004, 2005. So we really have less than 10 years of implementation. Part of the reason is that although the system created sets of targets and goals, there were no clear modalities to implement them. It took a while. And when they were proclaimed, they were proclaimed at a time in which there were clear tensions between many developing countries and the formula of development that were being implemented. The formula of development, which we in Africa and South Asia call structural adjustment programs, were a consensus mainly of matured economies and implemented via the international financial institutions through the modalities of conditionalities. This framework of conditionality-based implementation of development and created a situation in which the levels of trust was eroded already by the year 2000. And trust around, especially the delivery of aid, was quite low at that time. And the people there who conveyed the story of Millennium Development Goals were precisely the same people that implemented structural adjustment programs. So not surprisingly, the Millennium Development Program, modality that implemented the Millennium Development Program, the poverty reduction strategies, were the same. The poverty reduction strategies is the mechanism for liberalization and deregulation of the state, became the same mechanism for the implementation of the MDGs. The poverty reduction strategies, if you will recall, was an instrument, especially by the international financial institutions, to deliver both debt relief and program funding. And so this was the political atmosphere in which the Millennium Development Goals were finally introduced. So to make them acceptable, the part of it which was really promoted was the fact that it might leverage additional financial assistance and it will leverage additional debt relief. It took a while for many kind of governments in Africa to actually accept them as something inherent in their own planning, as opposed to another enforced set of programs. It did not help also in the way in which the UN system promoted them. My friend Professor Sachs was very, very, very happy and excited about them and did quite a lot of work in promoting them. But in promoting them as a means for leveraging large aid, ostensibly also led to a reduction in domestic ownership of them. Nevertheless, by 2005, 2006, most African countries in particular had integrated the Millennium Development Goals and were then struggling to find how to harmonize the constrained budgeting process, which was the remit of the poverty reduction strategy programs, and the expansive expectations for the delivery of services. And the fact that this additional financing that ought to come from the aid envelope was also then facing what the aid system calls predictability. You promise, but you don't deliver. You deliver at the wrong time. And so you have this discordance between expectations, actual delivery, governments promising, depending on international aid system that is highly unreliable and unpredictable. So in a way, in a sense, it took much longer to implement them. They are now up and running. There's a lot more national ownership of them as a recognition that in any case, the Millennium Development Goals takes us back to the agenda of the 1960s and early 1970s, which was the agenda of the nationalist leaders at the time, which is that political independence makes sense only if you eradicated hunger, ignorance, and disease. So education, healthcare, food as agriculture. So in a sense, reinterpreting them that way took them back. And this was important also because they were implemented at a time of the most difficult situation in all of these. The progress towards universal access to healthcare had been reversed through the privatization model and the reduction of state, and the transformation of the state's role from being a provider of services to being a supervisor of market mechanisms for providing services. Same with education, same with water. So in all of these indicators, food production, this access to healthcare and education had declined quite radically already from the late 1970s and accelerated in the 1980s. So by the time the MDGs were implemented, major indicators of development had gone red. In fact, life expectancy had reduced relative to the 1970s. Maternal mortality had increased relative to the 1970s. Child mortality had increased relative to the 1970s, and levels of illiteracy had increased relative to the 1970s. So in a sense, were implemented in a condition that were quite, you can compare to the story of the Greek god Sisyphus, basically given the task of pushing up a heavy stone up the hill. This point is important when we make an assessment of the rate of progress of the MDGs. So there are two ways to assess them. One is to assess them against the target, an average that starts from 1970 or 1980. The other is to assess them against the reality of the conditions, each country or continent's starting point in 2000. When you assess them against the starting point in 2000, the reality is completely different. We are about to release a report which is the UN system's regional agencies, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, and the Commission for Asia. This report will come out shortly because we were trying then to assess the MDGs relative to the starting point in 2000. Not relative to 1990 or an average to 1980. When we look at it that way, we looked at the MDGs indicators, 22 of them. Of these 22, we found 16 where there were at least consistent data for up to 101 countries. That included rich countries. To see relative to their starting point in the year 2000, how have these countries done in terms of acceleration, moving from their relative starting point to the year 2000. When we did this data on this multi-dimensional way of package of data for 16 indicators, 4 of the fastest performance of acceleration relative to their starting point in 2000 are African. Burkina Faso, Mozambique, Namibia, Rwanda. 15 of the top 20 countries are African. In these 16, that includes per capita incomes. Point I am making is, relative to their starting point, there has been quite a dramatic change. What has driven this change? First and foremost, one would say China. China, for a number of reasons, they consumed our natural resources. Remember, the African continent is the most dependent on natural resources relative to any continent. And so when we made a progress in the period 1960s and 70s, that coincided with increasing terms of trade for commodities. When the prices of commodities in the world market collapsed in the mid-70s, in addition to the increase in oil prices, the continent collapsed alongside it. When commodity prices increase, the continent's progress increases. This level of volatility and dependence is good and bad, mostly bad. But in this particular case, there has been a sustained increase in commodity prices for a very long time. The second reason, relative to 2000, is debt relief. Debt relief, I know we don't tend to remember it, but debt relief was kind of like a noose on the neck of most countries. They either had to borrow to repay debt or become totally dependent, including policy dependency, on those who gave them bits and pieces to survive. That means ambitious thinking, going outside the box, being able to spend on health and education from domestic resources was so constrained that any progress at all was totally dependent on what the external environment and international partners would deliver to them. Debt relief made a big change in fiscal space, allowing countries to actually spend a lot more. The third reason is population. Population is absolutely crucial. You have to remember, I know there's a negative, the way in which population is talked about is often very negative. It leads to, there are so many people chasing after very limited resources, and therefore it increases poverty. That's one side story. But if you look at 1960, when I was born, thereabout, the population of Ghana was 3.5 million people, scattered across the whole rural countryside. It is impossible to develop, to do investment in economies that grow in that way. Cost is tremendous. The demand size is small. So if you're slightly Keynesian oriented like me, then you know that demand is absolutely a critical component. Aggregate demand is a critical component of growth in economies. Anyway, several factors. And then there was an increased flow of investment, which allowed for bigger infrastructure investment that opened up markets in small rural countrysides. So there has been a change going forward. So what do we do from now going forward for post-2015? One, most African governments do want to keep the MDGs. There is not a big debate about it. Secondly, most African governments are realistic about international aid. What it can do, how much comes, how much to rely. In fact, sometimes it goes the other extreme. We no more want dependency on aid. And then you have this debate within the African Union and say, be realistic. There are many African countries that will not survive with international assistance. Besides, you cannot grow a private sector with ailing, sick, and hungry people. So ailing, sick, hungry, displaced people cannot give you the skill set and the workforce that is necessary to grow a private sector which is actually delivers development. So healthcare, education, water, rural roads, and building and dealing with the conflicts that are emerging, including the repetitive crisis, emergency and humanitarian crisis, is absolutely foundational for private sector to go. So there is a realism finished. But in dealing with that realism, we also must understand that foreign direct investment on its own does not deliver development. Ireland has several companies working in Africa, some doing relatively good work, like Guinea's, where the rate of profit reinvestment is higher in comparison with the oil companies, which are facilitating capital outflows through using tax havens. So in thinking forward, don't just think about the Robin Hood tax as a means of raising more additional assistance. Deal also with the types of things that attract capital outflows from Africa, so capital can be reinvested. There is a big debate picking up on post-2015. Happy to discuss that. Thank you.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for the invitation, Martina and Tidy. It's a pleasure to speak. Sometimes when I'm here, because I was here for 15 years, I have a tendency to walk out and go back to my office. I have to remind myself, no, I have to go. So I'm actually just going to talk about, I'm going to pick a point from each of the previous speakers and just to re-emphasize a certain amount of certain points that were made. Okay, the first one was from the Minister, and even though you can look at progress, one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, of the MDG project was a lot of the indicators are at the nation state or at the national level, right? And obviously that hides a lot of inequality intrastate, but the thing that's really been magnified, particularly in the last 5 years, is global inequality in general and the differences between the very rich and the poor. And I just want to give you just some examples. So people like to talk about income inequality, so I can give you something like the top 1% of the world, that's 61 million people, earn the same amount of income as the bottom 50% of the world, which is 3.5 billion people. Right? But let's not talk about income inequality. Let's talk about consumption. Okay? So what I've done is I've taken in today's world the top 20%, the richest 20% people. This is the top 1.5 billion, which is the OECD and the BRIC a little bit extended. We consume 80% of the world's products and production. 80%. The bottom 1.5 billion, the bottom 20% consume 1.5%. So we consume 80%, we're 1.5 billion people, and the bottom 1.5 billion consume 1.5%. Just in terms of our priorities, if in any year we gave up ice cream, cosmetics, ready-to-eat cereal, chocolate, we could actually, for those 1.5 billion people, we could give them universal access to health, education, food, and maternal health. I could fund it. This is the degree of global inequality that we have at the moment. Okay? So even though there's been an emphasis by Carl and even the previous speaker, Charles, on some more market-based initiatives inside the nation states, I have no problem with that. Any initiatives, economic, political, social inside Africa, I have no problem with. Right? Our biggest problem is that we don't have powerful enough global institutions to regulate the flows of capital, commodities, etc. And just to give you, so I'm just going to give you a bit of a thought experiment. I'm going to be a bit like John Lennon, and I'm going to go for big government. I'm going to say we're going to form one government for the world, one society, one market. And how would we act? Right? The first thing that we would do is that, because of my antitrust background, we have to understand, we talk about aid to Africa. We are highly subsidized. Everybody in this room is highly subsidized from the southern world in terms of the raw materials, cheap labor, etc. And even when we give safe havens to multinationals, that money has been generated from a lot of those subsidies, right? So we owe them. There's no doubt about it. And if you were an antitrust lawyer, you would look at the global institutions we have, like the World Trade Organization. They are not powerful enough to regulate global trade, right? We have a situation at the moment where we're capitalizing our banks who do not want to get involved in government bonds, so they're basically speculating on commodities and they're spiking them. They're going to cause a famine in Malawi, for sure. This is going to happen because Malawi will start exporting for higher prices. This is very dangerous, right? We are not regulating our global bond market. We're not regulating our commodity markets. The one thing that we do regulate, which we shouldn't, is the migration of people, right? Ironically, right? So you might be anti-economists, but we were always for mobility, like the regulated mobility of commodities and capital and people done in a fair way is something that can be a good, but we are not doing that, right? But I'm still in my one country model, and now I'm going to give you another statistic. I very much believe in social protection. I think it's a part of our psychic. And this is a very different way of thinking to aid our programs, right? So what I mean by social protection is the simple thing of unemployment. If you're separated from a job, whoever you are, you get some form of unemployment assistance. If you suffer from disability, you get support so the household can keep working, everybody can stay in school. If you just happen to get an infectious or long-term disease, you are supported. Just the very basic child care, etc. The very basics of social protection. In most of the top 1.5 billion, we have a social security system that's at least 10% of our GDP, at least, right? Canada are the meanest, okay? If I was the global government and I was to say I have to give at least 10% in what we call GDP PPP, so adjusting for purchasing power, right? And I calculated how much of the transfer, how we'd fund that social protection, how much would it be? Because we have a 70 trillion in PPP, this is correcting for purchasing power parity, we have something like, in today's world, $78 trillion is generated globally, and 40% in PPP comes from the global south, and let's say we give them 10% of that for social protection. Okay, that amounts to $3.1 trillion a year. Right? So people talk about, we've given Africa $1 trillion in the last. If we believe in any basic social entitlement, universal access to any sort of social security, the amount of money is $3.1 trillion a year. Right? What do we give? We have a commitment to give 0.7 of global GDP, which amounts to about 438 billion. And of course, we're all experts in this room because we know what that means. That's the same amount as our bank guarantee back in 2007. In reality, most of us don't meet those commitments, and it's only around 148 billion. Right? 148 billion is peanuts. It is peanuts. The idea that overseas development aid could do anything significant to political, economic, and social development is just not correct. It's not enough money. Right? Where would I generate this money? Well, obviously, if I was in a global, I'd be back to Micheal's point, is that if I was regulating and I was taking seriously empowering global institutions to regulate capital flows and commodity flows, even at 0.0001 tax on that sort of flow would give me enough money to fund my social security system. Okay, and I think it's an interesting way to think. Okay, now next point. So that's just to highlight. The MDG project is very focused on the nation state. What we should be focusing on is the global picture and global inequality, and because more and more we are integrated. In the environment we're integrated, but we're more and more integrated with companies and trade and with people flows and with other things, and we have to take that, the new project has to take that more seriously. Okay. Let's see what I have to do here. Okay. Right. Actually, my next point, before I get to here, I'll let you look at that. Politics. When the MDG project was formed, there is a kind of a guilt syndrome. That came from the OECD DAC. It was dreamt up by the top billion, and it was imposed on the poor. And this is for sure, right? This time round, coming up to seeing what's happening post-2015, what they're doing is they're saying we cannot do that again. We cannot do that again because it was noticed, right? So what the UN Secretary has come up with, and I suppose you're aware of, there seems to be 3 committees. This UN panel that David Cameron and the Minister from Indonesia and Liberia, they're meeting at the moment. And also there's a kind of what I call a bureaucratic run. And interestingly, one run by Jeff Sachs is this Global Solutions Network, which is coming through universities and NGOs and the private sector, and we'll hear more of that. But the whole idea is to have a bottom-up participatory approach. So, you know, we can actually ask the global poor or the global south, well, what do you think maybe should replace? How do you think the MDG is going, and what should replace it post-2015? Now, the problem I have, and as was noticed in the Guardian newspaper, etc., this is a very short clock. I don't know why this process wasn't started a few years ago, because here we are, 2012, and as you say, the last big meeting is 2013, and it's a very short period of time to have that conversation and to do that properly. The second thing is, even though it sounds interesting to have universities, NGOs, private sector, age agencies and whoever in one room having a discussion, believe me, that's not going to work out great. You know, it's going to be a little bit chaotic, right? So at the end of the day, there's some guy behind a desk, you know, in the UNDP, and they've already figured this out. They're just letting it. It's always good to have a consultation process. You know, it's great. But that's just to point out, you know, one of the big failings of the MDG project in a lot of ways is that the global north, you go into, there were surveys in Oxford, this would not happen in Trinity and UCD thanks to the Irish Aid and, you know, Tidy and HDI initiatives, but Oxford and the Ivy League in America asking some of the great minds of the world and the students who are there, and you say, can you list the MDGs? Do you know what they are? And they have no idea. And I'm sure if we took ministers, no idea. Ours would be a little bit better, I'm sure. But But yes, you go down into our program countries, and these MDGs are haunting them. They dictate everything, every interaction with a donor, every interaction with the IMF. These things are put on the table. What's your progress? How are you doing? Let's look at your child mortality rates. Let's look at this. Let's look at that. And, in all honesty, I think there is a need to have statistics, to know the geography of poverty, to understand exactly where children are dying. I think there is a need for this, but we have to understand that this was maybe an unintended consequences of the MDG project has to be corrected. I think the time clock they've left to correct that is a bit dangerous. Okay. Enough about that. So then, of course, as part of, nobody ever listens to the UCD academic anyway, but as part of these bottom-up consultative sort of approach, let me say what I think we should have a look at, or what are some other weaknesses. Okay. Another issue with the MDGs. So we talked about the nation-state issue. We've talked about how we actually, in a political process, come around to critiquing and establishing new goals. But one issue that they just don't talk about is governance. Who is the duty bearer? Like, who is actually responsible for achieving these goals? And if you don't achieve them, particularly for the global north, if we don't what's our punishment? What's the discipline, right? And to me, we've got to try and say, well, are we into my one government? Are we going to basically empower global institutions like the UNDP, maybe, or something like the IMF, World Bank, to do more competition stuff, or the WTO? Are we actually going to get more powerful in a global sense to be able to manage these things and to fund them and to discipline them, and every country involved, which for climate change it looks like we do? Or do we drive it to the nation state? Are we just going to make it each nation individual responsible? Or do you drive it even down lower to community or civil society? But the issue is that there is no clear governance or duty bearer in this project. And a lot of people are saying you need something post-2015 where somebody has responsibility for achieving and somebody has to regulate and enforce, some form of enforcement. Okay. How I think this could be done, two simple ones. I'd actually like to separate humanitarian assistance from development. And rather than having some fluffy goal saying you have to reduce hunger by 66% of the 1990 level, which could still leave 30% of your population going to bed hungry, and we all think we've achieved goal 1, I think we should have zero in this day and age, given our technologies and global responses and rapid global response. I think we can have a zero tolerance to hunger. I can actually say that what we can say in the 21st century is that through our humanitarian aid reactions, that we should basically say that zero tolerance to hunger. Right? So, not to get confused, some people get confused that what you really mean by hunger is developing agriculture and agribusiness, etc. But I think basically when people are undernourished, there has to be a global response. We understand it in a famine situation, but even outside a famine situation, I think we should have zero tolerance for that. Okay? In terms of social inclusion, I just want to show you a graph. If I can do it, run out of time. So you can have great fun with this. So it's physics technology, but you can go to the UNDP website and what's called the Data Explorer, and you can graph everything against everything. Right? The one thing that shouldn't be a surprise to us is that not that I agree totally with this gender inequality index that's derived. There's problems with it. Okay. But it's a score between 0 and 1 about gender empowerment. But we could critique it, but let's say we trust it, okay? If you graph that, here I've graphed it against the Human Development Index, but you can graph it against child mortality rates. You can graph it against anything, right? And one thing that will happen, and I just want you to watch this going back in time, right? So this is human development here, right? So countries that empower women, these are the countries where middle in terms of empowerment. What's happening over all these years is that one issue is there all the time, right? That discrimination against women and lack of empowerment of women both in social, political, economic spheres is the biggest problem that actually constrains development, both economic, social, and any form of development. Are we addressing this? in post-2015. And you would think in our society, you think this would be, oh, we're just forgetting about it, or we don't think it's important. But it's actually a highly fueled political issue for these 200 nations, because there's just very, very different beliefs about the role of women in society. And it just becomes a difficult conversation. In fact, it's nearly easier to talk about sustainable development indicators and talk about the environment and future generations, which we know is impossible to talk about, than to talk about something as simple as gender empowerment. Right? So, in general, I would prefer to see, rather than the Millennium Development Goals, or an approach, because it creates a duty bearer. But I'm sounding like Mary Robinson here, but I would like to see in the constitutions of countries to put in the social and economic rights that we've all signed up to in the Human Rights Declaration, and I'd like to see them imposed. Right? And in a way, countries, Mexico has done this, countries that do this give themselves a framework. It empowers the individual that I know I basically discriminate against an inheritance or opportunity, and I can go to court and I can fight it on the Constitution. They give them an instrument, because again we have to go, the problem with the approach at the moment is that we obviously want everybody to access food and water, we want gender, and we want these things, but we're not giving people an instrument or a way to achieve these things, and we have to do something, right? So one proposal is through a rights base, whether it's through humanitarian action or through constitutional change and legal enforcement. That is a very powerful instrument to get us some of the biggest problems. I think social exclusion, particularly of women, is probably the biggest problem that we have to nail to actually move forward. Last point on Rio Plus, and then I'll stop. Okay, I think the environment guys are great. So what they're after doing is handing over a problem that they can't solve, and they're going to hand it over to the MDG project, and next thing say, well, just have your economic and your social indicators and add the sustainable development indicator. Make a new HDI, so that social and economic development have to be consistent with a sustainable environment. And that sounds fine, but then let's get the metric and the politics behind this and the governance behind it, and all the rounds that we've had on climate change. It is just very difficult. So somehow the governance issue is difficult because people don't want to release power to some global entity. Gender is difficult. Environment issues are difficult. And unfortunately, my prediction is, even though those things should be there post-2015, in this political or bottom-up, top-down, whatever process, you will see the same old goals as all outcomes that we all agree with. We all should have access to water, right? Access to clean air, sure. Access to food. Everybody should go to school. We can all agree on that. But can we agree on the instruments, how to achieve it? And can we agree on who is the duty bearer and where that lies? That is the problem.
Thanks very much, Paul, and to all of our speakers. So we're running behind schedule, but in the interest of equity and equality, I think I'll borrow 10 minutes from the questions and answer session later and use this now. And maybe borrow 5 minutes from coffee as well, if that's okay with everybody. So we'll open the floor to questions, and please can you say who you are and where you're from, and who your question is directed to. So I think I'll take a couple of questions at a time.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a missionary. Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a missionary in South Africa. I'm open for the game. I agree. I'm asking Professor Walsh. The goals are noble. They're clear. They're precise. There seems no cohesive strategy to implement them. So, in my opinion, the special event in 2013 should be around having a strategy or a roadmap to implement the goals, and having a mechanism to make sure that will happen. Is that realistic?
Okay. We take another question, maybe? Martina?
Martina from Tidy, obviously. But to all of you, really, I suppose, and mainly to Charles, what do you say to the idea that the goals, while very noble, were simplistic, and that particularly the healthcare goals, which focus on HIV and maternal mortality, have come at the expense of developing a proper universal healthcare system, and the goal of primary education has come at the expense of developing intellectual capital for self-determination?
Okay. One more question? Down the back. You get the mic down there.
Olive Towie from Concern. I'd like to ask all of the panellists their views on, I think the gentleman from the UNDP talked about African governments wanting to continue with the MDGs, and in a way, whatever their origins and the top-down sort of dilemma, how can we generate a discussion that is truly inclusive and have this consultation process that is credible, and at the same time that reaches a conclusion. So I agree that it's very important to have a consultative process, and on the other hand, how does that reach a conclusion that has the buy-in and has the ownership and has that reflects the participation of civil society and others? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Maybe we'll take one more and then we'll turn to the panel.
My name is Neeta. I am a PhD student at UCC. I am just wondering, what is the Irish position to development going to be? Is it going to be charity-based as in the past, like the missionaries or some of the international NGOs have led, or is it going to be rights-based?
Thank you. Okay, Charles, perhaps we'll start with you because there's a couple of questions specifically directed there.
There are many problems with those goals. But again, the reason why many African countries would like to continue with them is because they have invested over 5-6 years trying to understand the implications for development. But they do not just want to continue with them. They have ambitions higher than that. Now, I mean, as I was explaining, the history of them are very important. They did help to do one thing, to put back the role of the state as central to delivering basic services to people. This is very crucial in our continent for even building trust in the democratic processes, which eventually is becoming the basis for constitution as instruments for enforcing rights. Because people need to have something, that binds them with the state. So the expectations of services, and therefore the right to services, in exchange for the citizen obligation. So this is very important, and we must now go beyond, as somebody has said, small proportions to a universal model. And now it is possible to even conceptualize a universal right to health care, a universal right to education, not just enrollment, but good quality education, and so on and so forth. So it takes the discussion several steps forward. So when I say I agree that there's simplicism, but it has helped solve one big problem from which we can go one step forward in defining the role of the state to citizens. On the consultation process, there is a lot already beginning at multiple levels. At the country level, many of us have seen this post-2015 thing just as one more opportunity to facilitate interaction between citizens and state from local government level upwards, to create voices for very excluded populations about their expectations of their state. So in a sense, we are still statists in that sense, in terms of duty bearer. If we can do that, whatever evolves out of it enhances again the democratic process. So at one level, it's about exploiting the spaces for citizen voices that shapes national planning processes, that shapes national priorities. And that ought to feed then into other levels. In the case of Africa, the African Union, but also the regional commissions are also conducting intergovernmental and civil society conversations. So that feeds into another level. So multiple levels of interaction. Whatever ends up as a global consensus at least has helped, to catalyze and continue to broaden the spaces for interaction in shaping public policy. So we see the process as serving several goals and at multiple levels. In any case, whatever comes out as global compromise has to be implemented at national and community level.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to comment now?
Well, it's this issue over sovereignty. You know, I mean, it's just going to be so difficult for governments to concede on sovereignty, but also concede on what they would consider their values and their cultures or their way of life. And it's just, even though it seems like we should be able to have instruments and duty and regulation and enforcement, it's very, very difficult. Very, very difficult, right? Unfortunately, something like climate change leading us on the brink of a complete collapse in the could do it. Do you know what I mean? Something like that could actually drive us to, even this bond market could actually all drive us to having to have a common sort of structure or committee. So but let's hope it's not too late when people start having like minds to deal with global issues. So I'm pessimistic about this. I think it takes health indicators. I actually think child mortality rates and maternal mortality, I think they're more general indicators than you think. Like a doctor looks at them as being very narrow, but I actually think they do reflect all stresses and strains in society, both economic, political and social, and I think they're very good indicators. The one that I could concede on is that when you look at the HIV malaria, right, a lot of people in Africa tell us that very simple illnesses, like a temperature or a little operation that you need, can actually put a house out of action because of the lack of social protection, but also just lack of simple healthcare, right, and education around healthcare. And there's a lot of diseases that could be dealt with, not prioritised or not talked about at all. And one would wonder is that if you actually put 80% of the money and effort into that rather than malaria and HIV, would you not have a more successful outcome, right? So I think that goal, the HIV goal or the infectious disease goal, TB is there now, but I think it could be, you could generalise that a bit more into the actual real sort of look at the prevalence of certain operations that are needed or interventions that are needed, and actually to actually treat the population with the resources that you have. I think there's an issue around that. So I agree about, this is the big point about, so by actually, for me, to talk about social protection in this general way and to talk about universal access and universal rights and to let the state basically be the, for me, I think even with this multilateral structure I'm thinking of, I always believe partnership comes when you pay 50%, right? So if this global fund, which taxes the Tobin tax, said for every let's say in people, which adjust for purchasing power parity though, right? So you effectively would be giving more money, but for every dollar that you take out of your tax structure and give to social protection, universal access to health, and we would match it, or even maybe go to 4, and then PPP it would be a lot more money, right? And the idea there is that not only it basically shows, and it gives a kind of ownership, but also a capability, a financial capability, but also a kind of joint responsibility then over enforcement, right? And that to me is very much easier than getting involved in trade and capacity building in government or in schooling or in education, all these sort of things, right? And I do think Africa really needs this, because 66% of a lot of developing world's population are under the age of 25. And there's a lot of children and there's a lot of women who are responsible for that health and education. And I think for business, for political development, for civil society, for all these issues, we have to ensure that women and children are given the best, some form of social protection, and not on, it's not they get it like they just maybe need it for 6 months or just an intervention here and there, but this is what we're used to, universal access, but we take it when we need it, right? And we endogenously select to it. We don't have these programs that are ad hoc, regional focused, thematic focused, run, don't run, I know it's a lot more money, and I know it's a big change for Africa to look to the state for that sort of service, but that just happens in the global north. I can't see if we're imposing our will and models on them, well, maybe this one is the one that we should be doing rather than all the other ones that we're doing. Okay.
Micheal, do you have some?
Yeah, I won't cover the same ground from the other speakers, other than to make one point, which is, if are the MDG goals simple? Well, for the most part, yes, but that's probably where we needed to start. And in fact, sadly, we've been stuck there for a long time. We should proceed from simple to complex. I think, touching on what Paul said, one of the great challenges there is that when you move beyond the simple to the complex, it begins to cost more and more to do, and then either internally, externally, or globally, to go back to that, we need to find we need to figure out the resources to do that. And if we're not in a position to be able to have a realistic set of objectives around the provision of resources, the realpolitik is the brakes come on. They come on internationally, they come on domestically. We've got to be able to overcome that, because then that removes that barrier, and then we can start pursuing them.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions right now. We'll take 10 minutes for coffee and we'll resume at 11:30 with our next panel discussion. Thank you.